Hello and welcome to the webinar, Energy Storage, the Game Changer for Renewables. I'm Luke Brett from Reuters Events, currently focusing on renewable projects. This is one of several pieces of work we're doing on renewable energy trends. There are over 1,300 of you signed up today. So thank you very much for the great response, and thank you in advance to our panelists for their time. Just a brief bit of housekeeping before we begin. This webinar will last an hour and is being recorded. So we will send you the full audio within a week or so. You do have the facility to ask the questions through the question box, so do keep those coming in. We have 4 panelists joining us today who will be shortly introducing themselves. Again, do ask those questions and point them out to the specific panelists if you have a specific question. Without further ado, we'll begin. Julian, who will be moderating the session, do make an introduction.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luke, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending where in the world you're joining us from. Really exciting topic today, talking about how energy storage can really change the picture for renewable deployment and help us achieve the carbon reduction goals and energy transition across the world. And I'm really excited about the panelists today. Joining me, we've got Laura Sanley, CBE, who's the former chair of the UK Energy Data Taskforce, who's been heavily involved in looking at how data can help deliver a more optimized energy system. We've got Kevin Lynn, who's a director for grid integration at the US Department of Energy, Chris Buckland, who's technical director at BB Lightsource, so a major developer of solar and storage assets, and Nick Heyward from Statkraft here in the UK, who's responsible for the energy storage operations of Statkraft here, who's got a lot of experience. Actually, I think we've been walking across each other at conferences for the last 7 years or so, so really excited to have the panel together. In terms of structure, what we'll do today is we'll do a brief scene setter, so I've prepared a couple of high-level slides to just get everyone onto the same page and set the scene for discussion, and then we'll go straight into the panel discussion and hear from our very knowledgeable panelists that we've got on the call today. As Luke said, if you have any questions, please fire them away. We're going to have a few discussion points that we want to get through, but really it's here all about answering your questions. We've got hundreds of attendees, so please take the opportunity and fire away, and we'll answer them the best we can throughout today's podcast. So some of the big key themes that I want to just highlight and kind of set the scene to understand why this topic is so important. So when we look at the energy industry as a whole, renewable energy is now the cheapest form of renewable generation, but at the same time we're seeing a number of carbon intensive sectors electrifying, whether that's transport, whether that's heating, and that's fundamentally changing the way electricity is generated and consumed. And storage in its many different forms is becoming a competitive source of flexibility that is needed to help achieve the decarbonization goals within the power sector, but it also provides very unique value across different applications. And that's something that we'll talk about today, both in the way how energy storage links in with renewables, but also how it plays a much wider role in stabilizing our energy system. And then finally, of course, a lot of the talk today is around batteries and how competitive they are, especially for short duration applications, but it's very clear that the field is much wider and much more open, especially when we start looking at the long-term need for long duration bulk energy storage within our energy system. Now, why is this such a hot topic? As I just mentioned, we've seen renewable costs come down significantly over the last 10 years or so. We're seeing the electrification of heat of transport, the digitalization of our energy system, and really flexibility needed on both the supply and demand side will become much more significant, and storage is really at the heart of this energy transition. And that's what we can see when we look at the long-term outlook for storage deployment. We're seeing huge growth projected out to 2025, especially driven initially by growth in the US, where a lot of storage deployment is coupled with renewables, but also across the world. And if we look even longer term, the need for storage will be much more amplified as renewable deployment increases, but also as infrastructure needs to be upgraded to keep pace with renewables. And I think what's quite important, and I just want to highlight this one slide, and then we'll jump straight into discussion with the panelists today, is really that storage historically has been very much focused on individual applications not related to renewables. So often frequency regulation, capacity services, on the behind the meter side around energy cost optimization. But what we're seeing now is as storage costs have come down, they are becoming more competitive for longer duration applications, more able to competitively firm renewables, but also as regulatory frameworks have developed, are much more able to value stack, so provide different types of services with the same system, and through that become more competitive and play an even more pivotal role in our transitioning energy system. So with that, I want to jump straight into the discussion. We're actually going to stop sharing the slides so you can see our faces, which hopefully will make the discussion a little bit more engaging and easy to follow. So straight away, let me pass the baton on to Laura, who, Laura, you used to be, or you are the chair of the UK Energy Data Taskforce. So what role do you see energy storage playing towards enabling achieving our renewable targets? And how does that relate to the work you do day to day?
Well, I always like to plan from the future. And so if we're starting to look, and the future is probably almost today anyway, we're looking at multiple peaks, not just demand peaks, which we've been living with for a long time. We've actually got supply peaks. We'll then have EVs. We'll have lots of system abnormalities and erraticness. And at the heart of this, we really need storage, very similar to the food system. Food system has refrigeration, whether that be in the field, right the way through warehousing, right the way into our domestic kitchen. And the point with it is that the word storage, in my view, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, is actually a misnomer, because actually these are all different technologies with different functions within the supply chain. And we've created a big umbrella when actually what we're talking about, quite different things, very exciting, and it is absolutely crucial. When we come to heat decarbonisation, certainly in the UK, we are talking between 8 and 10 times the peak that we're talking about through electricity. If we can't interseasonally store, if we can't so-called create frozen food, and whoever creates the frozen food of the energy sector is going to be very rich. Thank you.
That's a great analogy. No, I really like that analogy, and I think it's definitely on the right track and what we need for the energy transition. So maybe kind of throwing it over to Kevin from a slightly different perspective over from the US. I mean, as your role as director for grid integration, I'm sure you look at the role storage can play in enabling renewables a lot. So how do you judge that role that storage will play, and is storage really necessary to achieve decarbonization goals?
So I think energy storage is incredibly important to the Department of Energy. And I'm from the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. So obviously trying to integrate, renewables, solar, wind, especially are critical for us. I think, the idea of also, thinking of it from a grid modernization perspective and thinking of it, we come from, investment in research and development primarily. But reliability of the power, how energy storage plays a role in the reliability and the resilience of the power system, and how does that overall sort of work together to bring in renewables? So, and obviously, as you look at, if you look at a variety of targets, as you look at 30%, 40%, 50%, energy storage starts to play different roles. As you said, at first, you're thinking of how can you manage, very short term, maybe you're thinking about ancillary services, or you're thinking about certain kinds of contingencies, you're thinking about flexibility, but then as you get to higher and higher penetrations, you think about longer and longer term storage. And I think a key for us at the Department of Energy is not, I used to always hate the question when we get it from Congress, hey, what are you all doing in energy storage? Because energy storage comes in so many flavors, and it comes across the department. So if you think about thermal energy storage from our buildings perspective, we think about energy storage from our vehicles program, which spends $100 million a year on vehicles, on energy storage for vehicles. We think about basic science with our Caesar program, looking at the very basics of energy. So, I mean, it really goes across a broad spectrum of energy storage. And part of what we're trying to do as part of our energy storage grand challenge is take all those different pieces where energy storage lies across our R&D portfolios and think about what's the broad, how to bring all those pieces together, and how does the system, the power system work together, and utilize all those different elements of energy storage to provide higher renewables, but also a more reliable and more resilient system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's crucial. Reliability and resilience are really two aspects that will be crucial as we see higher renewable penetration. And maybe kind of throwing it over to you, Chris, from more of a private sector perspective. Obviously, BP Lightsource, you're a very successful developer, especially of solar plants. So how do you judge the role storage can play alongside solar across the world? And yeah, what's the kind of what's your view on the role storage will play alongside that?
Yeah, I think we're moving, as you mentioned before, we're moving from co-location of storage as a standalone asset, maybe sharing a grid connection with a solar plant, forward now to the point where the real challenge that we have is solar is relatively cheap, certainly less than, for example, 2 US cents per kilowatt hour, whereas storage itself is about 6 US cents per kilowatt hour at the moment. So what we've been following in the last 3 years is every single of the larger scale solar deployment we've been doing around the globe and in the 14 countries that we're active. We do look at, is there a straightforward basic opportunity for load shifting, for peak lopping effectively within the solar context. And that's what we've been in the last 3 years. Within the last year, however, we are seeing the level of renewable penetration restricting our ability to deploy solar, whether that be in Australia or indeed in the UK. And now we have the additional opportunity to take relatively short-term bulk storage, energy storage, in order to enable higher penetration on the grid. And for example, recently, providing grid services even from solar at night. If we're talking about using solar and storage, so for example, the flattening a day, that is still well out of context, at least as far as lithium ion is concerned. A 5 megawatt solar plant, relatively small, would eat up or fill up a 5 megawatt battery within an hour. So lithium ion for anything beyond the 2 to 4 hours duration, for example, that we see on the west coast of the US, is less likely. And this is where we roll over onto the potential other forms of storage. Clearly on the BP horizon, we have hydrogen and green hydrogen, also mentioned within the UK context for 2050. But there may be some other things in between there, pump storage, and even hydro, for example, in Brazil, is a very nice sort of virtual battery that we can use to increase our ability to deploy solar at grid level. So our core business absolutely deploys solar, but batteries are now becoming an enabler for us to push that solar up. And here in the UK, during the challenging time that we've had, there's up to 70% renewables on the UK grid, or at least carbon free on the UK grid. And that is where storage, I think, will play a role going forward as the penetration levels go higher and higher.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you touched up on a really interesting point there in terms of technology diversity. So let's pass it on kind of to finish up this initial scene setting discussion, pass it over to Nick. Nick, you obviously have a lot of experience from your years in the storage industry, both on the technical and commercial side with Statkraft. So specifically, you've been heavily involved in the development of the battery storage industry here in the UK and Ireland. So what role do you think batteries play in particular in enabling greater renewable penetration?
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly a big role. And I guess I focus more now on that kind of commercial optimization of storage in the markets. So Statkraft markets provide that kind of market integration piece for storage at the moment. And you know what's interesting is we've been offering optimization services around that for some years now, and without exception, you know, all of those independent kind of projects that have come forward, at least in the UK, that were providing trading optimization, routes to market through ancillary services, have all been, you know, perhaps unexpectedly, these kind of shorter duration, fast acting storage designed for these very short flexibility requirements, or kind of intraday flexibility requirements we have. But you know, what's interesting is kind of looking forward to 2050, even sort of 2030, that flex requirement, the kind of intraday swings just from the scale of renewables that we need to get to, you know, goes far beyond what those kind of technologies alone can provide. So, you know, it's interesting for us to see, you know, what's the investment model, what's the optimization approach for those types of longer duration technologies. I don't see that there's an obvious route to market for those right now based on the value streams, the value pools that are available to those shorter duration assets so much. I mean, yes, they perhaps play a part, but I think they need a slightly different investment model. So for me, yeah, I think, you know, that's the interesting thing here, and perhaps just touching on Ireland, Statkraft as a group, we have also made some of our own investment in battery storage deployments in Ireland, the first one to go live in the market just this year. But the reason, I guess, Statkraft as a group, we've got more comfortable with the investment side and deployment of storage there is the slightly different market structure and investment signal they have there, which is very closely linked with that desire to get the island system up to a higher penetration of renewables. And you know, that approach has kind of helped us and other investors, I think, get more comfortable in those kind of markets where that market design is very favorable in terms of supporting the system directly to achieve this much higher level of renewables.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, maybe stay a little bit on this kind of market design as well as technology issue, because I think they're quite closely linked, because ultimately a lot of the long duration technologies can only be enabled by changing market design. So maybe throwing it back at the other panelists here, how do you guys see it? First of all, what do you think needs to change in terms of market design? Depending on your respective regions. I know we come from different places on this webinar here, but also what technologies do you think are most promising in enabling that? I don't know, do any of you three have a particular opinion on that?
I mean, I really come from a policy background and a political background, and currently what we're trying to do is we're trying to squeeze a totally different set of assets with totally different characteristics into a fossil fuel commodity price type market environment. And as they're capital assets, and the commodity is of very, very little value once you've paid off the capital, what you do with that electron is actually what matters, where the value is added. And we're actually costing the wrong thing. So what we need to be doing is valuing the processing of the electron. And I think there are some really interesting things. Most of the markets, as Nick rightly says, get cannibalized very, very quickly. They're not long-term enough because all they're doing is really talking about system management and not overall cost of the energy system. So if you look at some of the metrics, and I'd love to know more from Kevin about the avoided cost of energy metric, which actually, when you start to look at blended products and sort of the metrics of the matrix of these different assets, you start to really bear down on the costs. And currently in the UK, what's been happening in the last 3 or 4 months is a massive amount of excess supply, which we socialize. So you and I pay for that. Actually, if we had proper storage technologies and we valued it in a very different way, we wouldn't be picking up the tab. It would be captured. It would be then utilized when needed.
Well, this is Kevin. So maybe I will be a little bit careful with Mark. Department of Energy really focuses on R&D. We don't really, we try to develop tools and technologies that can help people make the best decisions. I think one of the things that we from DOE see as helpful is that, there's a broad, we talk about lithium ion or talk about chemical storage, electrochemical storage all the time, but I think there's a variety of it's pumped storage, hydro or thermal, that are not probably well represented from a data perspective or a tools perspective, that need to people need to understand how those technologies influence the grid in a better way. And I think that could lead to a better valuation in the markets. Obviously markets, that's a very long and broad conversation, but I think even just sort of developing some of the tools that help enable people to see what the real value of some of the energy storage technologies are, whether it be electrochemical, thermal, or even just demand, different kinds of smart demand response. I think there's a lot of value in really having some clear understanding of where that value lies. Then markets can then it's up to the markets to determine best how to value some of that if they have a better understanding of what it can or can't provide.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe on that note, I'm just going to take one of the questions that has just come through from the audience, because clearly, but based on what both Kevin and Laura, what you've just said is, really it's all about a market design framework that would accurately value the services that storage would provide, and that would then enable technology variety and enable storage. So the question we got from the audience is asking whether government assistance is really needed to boost battery storage, or whether the industry will develop without that government boost. And maybe throwing that to Chris and Nick, what you guys think about it. From what Laura and Kevin say, clearly it's not about government funding or government boosters, it's more about regulatory changes, and that will then enable technology variety in the market. Do you guys agree with that, or would you say actually we need some more direct government assistance?
I would pick up probably on Nick's point as far as Ireland was concerned, and then almost the legislative environment, and that's not direct funding in Ireland. So the DS3 procedure over there, which includes things like reactive power to a certain extent, black start and ride-through capability, all of those kinds of things, within a regulatory framework without funding, direct funding, will encourage and does stimulate those kinds of positions, and they do have real value, and they are being monetized, and that's the only market that we're aware of where there's a very clear procedure, and I think 13 different grid support services which are valued. Again, take the UK, as Laura was saying, we've paid to turn down nuclear in order to allow the renewables on, and that's probably not the right way to do it. On a sort of a larger macro scale, what we're doing from the Lightsource side together with our big brother is to look at the benefits of solar and wind and bringing together a single package, so that we can get capacity factors up to something like 70% rather than the 50 and the 20, for example, for solar. Now, we're doing that because of pure economics. However, presumably there could be a regulatory pressure or enthusiasm from the environment to ask renewable generators to join up the dots as far as the communication, as far as the digitalization of this generation is concerned, and then bring that to market. Currently, what happens is each of the individual players, each of the individual technologies are going to a trading desk, and the trading desk is juggling a lot of things, but the value could be earlier on at the generation point, if there was motivation within that. But currently the electrons that are generated by renewables, they're not smart. And because they're not smart, it's a kilowatt hour is worth this, and either you have a relatively short-term traded view of the world, which is pretty much where the batteries have to sit, unfortunately, or you try to get a 10 or 15-year flat PPA, which again is not practical. On a sunny day here in the UK, the last thing you want to do really on the grid is to have be paying the same rate for a kilowatt hour as you are in winter at 3 o'clock in the morning when you need the power. So I think no direct subsidies necessarily, but certainly some guidance from the regulatory environment to value what currently is a relatively dumb electron. And Nick, I don't know what your thoughts are along those lines.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a bit of both. Industry alone, I don't think will take it far enough. It does need some structural kind of market design that's well thought through and supporting that, policy supporting that, because you're absolutely right. We do have actually customers that have long duration technologies that they want to try and bring to market, but what they're having to do is come and talk to us about, okay, what's the value available that I can see today that I can try and capture, and you know, what we're able to do there is the same kind of optimization, generally short-term power markets, ancillary services. But the problem that they tend to have there is it's a little bit of square peg round hole situation, and even something like efficiency, let's say, is a really important characteristic when it comes to kind of marginal cost of operation and capturing spreads in the market. So actually, you know, what we see on other types of technologies, lithium ion predominantly, is even quite small gains in efficiency can lead to, you know, reasonable improvements in the value from churn actions in the market. And what I mean by that is sort of profitably buying back traded positions and retrading throughout the day, and that generates a lot of value because we have quite a nice continuous intraday market in the UK. But generally, and I'm kind of generalizing here, so apologies if there are any long duration technologies on the call that don't agree with this, but generally they tend to have slightly lower kind of round trip efficiencies for conversions of kind of energy at scale, and so instantly you're at a bit of a disadvantage in that kind of optimization strategy or that kind of optimization model. But I do kind of feel for them there, because that, you know, that's what's on the table at the moment. Those are the signals, at least in GB, that are there. You know, so whereas, yeah, as Laura already said, you know, what's needed is more of a structural kind of market shift to valuing what those kind of longer duration technologies bring to the market. And maybe one thing to mention as well on this is probably the nearest thing I've seen in GB is some of the Pathfinder projects that Grid are doing. So the Stability Pathfinder, which it's not going to help long duration technologies, but it's a specific kind of investment signal that said we have an issue kind of on the horizon here that we need solving to kind of deal with very high levels of renewables and falling inertia on the system, and they've put out, you know, albeit as a kind of pilot, some very firm kind of investment signals in a way, and reasonably decent term contracts to solve that problem. So, you know, there are examples where there are kind of interventions made to help bring forward investments like that, but I don't think there's enough yet for those kind of bulk storage technologies.
No, absolutely, and I think we're probably all in agreement here. But I think something that I've just seen another question come in, which actually kind of goes along the same lines. That, well, obviously today in the market, the way the market is set up and the way market frameworks work clearly favors very efficient, shorter duration lithium-ion batteries, and that's pretty much the case across the world, wherever we look, whether it's Europe, the US, or looking at Asia and China, or also Australia. But someone's asked the question here: will battery storage mean we could ever have 100% renewable supply? And if I read the answers correctly, as well, no, because ultimately well, we have to frame battery storage broader, but at least with lithium-ion batteries, I don't think that will be likely. And I'd be interested to hear your view, and maybe add a question on if you'd have to really, you know, use your crystal ball and say, if we're not using lithium-ion batteries to achieve that long duration bulk storage, what other technology would you bet on, so to speak? I don't know, Kevin, do you want to kick us off? I think you've done a lot of testing and a lot of research.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to try. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is solving this is not 100% renewables is not going to be solved with energy storage. You're not going to say, oh, well, I've energy storage is the panacea. There's a lot of other challenges with 100% renewables. So I just want to make sure that that's clear to folks. I think it's completely doable, and but it's just there's other challenges we have to address along the way. But that said, I mean, I do think, you know, if you listen to, you know, within DOE with our energy storage grand challenge, or even IEA had some recent, you know, I think there's a lot more to be done in the energy, and we probably need to be advancing more, you know, research in the energy storage area in order to address, you know, not only the lithium ion, which we're still spending in lithium ion every year, about $100 million per year, just in lithium ion, just on vehicle programs. And I think it's critical to try to meet some of the $100 per kilowatt hour targets and below that they're trying to meet in the vehicles program. That said, there's a whole host of other technologies, you know, whether it's pump storage, hydro, you know, that's a key area where, while it's regional, there's the long duration storage aspect of it is really open, you know, wide open, and could be, you know, you can be doing a lot with that. Equally with, you know, to get away from electrochemical, I mean, some of the hydrogen storage work, I mean, there's some really great targets that we have in our hydrogen and fuel cell technology office, where they're trying to look at how that hydrogen specifically, whether you're in fluid, you know, with gas or without gas, you know, a lot of different ways to address that fuel cell piece or hydrogen piece. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the long term. And I think there's a lot more work to be, you know, when I saw the question, are we done with the battery storage? I was like, oh, I hope not. I don't think so. There's a lot of really exciting work that to be done, both in chemical storage and, you know, in our office electricities, focusing on flow batteries. I mean, that's a wide open area that, you know, there's very little deployment there, and a lot more research to be done to meet some cost targets. So the cost, I think there's a lot to be done on the cost target side with some individual technologies, and there's a lot of really interesting work to do on the system side. How do all those pieces fit together so we can reach those kind of goals? I mean, I think that's another piece, the systems piece, and as opposed to the technology innovation piece. Those both have to go together to try to solve this challenge.
Absolutely. Chris, I think you wanted, oh, sorry, go on, Laura.
I just wanted to sort of follow on from that. I totally believe the system is in many ways the issue, and that's why I'm passionate about data and the flow of data. And I think Chris made a really important point about actually what we shouldn't be doing is we shouldn't be talking about one technology versus another. This is the geeks, all of us, right, in the energy sector are all keen to talk about their particular pet technology. It's not. It's about the blending of these technologies, looking at the application and creating markets that actually unlock outcomes, not technologies. And we had it right at the very beginning of the renewables sector, where we had solar people beating up wind people because they were all, you know, the evil people taking my money out of my children's mouths. Fundamentally, we need it all. And that is to do with both systems, but also the market and market design, allowing for much more integrated, sophisticated business models. So again, the sector, the regulator, the regulations, the policy looks at us all as if we're vanilla ice cream, when actually what we should be looking at is much more complex business models. But each of the markets are so siloed that you have to behave differently to enter each of those markets. And so I'm doing some work on this, which is actually trying to break all of that out, because we need outcomes. And it's not about batteries versus hydro. It's about it all.
I would pick up a bit, however, on technology now. We're talking lithium and potentially hydrogen. So we did do back then the calculations in the UK for every 1 megawatt of solar, to flatten that over seasonally for 24/7, we would need 8 megawatt hours of battery. Yeah, so the fact that actually a megawatt hour of batteries is about 3 times more expensive anyway than solar just means that this is a non-starter. So lithium ion, or let's say an on-site energy storage, and whether it's sodium batteries, for example, or whether it's flow batteries, at the end of the day, as I mentioned before, a 5 megawatt solar farm will produce 5 megawatts within 1 hour, so the battery just needs to be huge. So where do we go from here in terms of our ambition to deploy more and more solar? I think there are 2 or 3 parts. One is the ability to connect to the grid and to ensure that the grid is able to accept the renewable power. So inertia is a classic one. And we've seen, I think today or yesterday, there's some very large flywheels going up in Scotland, in the UK, to provide some inertia so that more renewables can come on board. But a flywheel, again, is not generating electricity, it's sort of enabling more renewables on. So let's think about that area, potentially digitalizing that. As far as long-term energy storage, let's think of it in a different view, which would be the hydrogen, whether that's ammonia, sort of blue hydrogen or green hydrogen. Generating hydrogen from a renewable plant, and ideally so wind and solar combined, and then having that fuel in the form of an LNG kind of approach in order to be able to ship that through either gas network pipeline and or shipping from a sunny place of Southwest Australia and then shipping it up to Japan or other areas where that energy could be used, is probably going to bring us a very long way in the right direction. And this isn't interseasonal, and this isn't overnight. It's not time of day or week to week. This is almost condensing energy into a package that can then be transported to an area where it can be valued and brought into the grid. Now, this is not so sophisticated in terms of manipulating or changing the market, but clearly on the solar side, for example, we get 2.5 to 3 times more kilowatt hours for a solar plant in Australia than we do in Northern Europe. So given that in Northern Europe solar works, we have that differentiation in energy or in value of energy to enable potentially producing hydrogen and the inefficiency of the round trip of hydrogen to bring that product up to the market where it's required. So on the technology side, the long game, looking at hydrogen, there's a lot of excitement across the globe, particularly in Europe right now. We can see a lot of logic for that, but this is not going to happen by 2030. It's probably not going to be really in volume by 2040, maybe 2050. However, the investment there are billions and billions, and that is where I think we have to come back to government support, which is where it is at the moment, in order to bring those things on. It's not something you can pilot in a field around the outside of the M25 here in London. This is billions of pounds worth of approach and investment to see how that technology potentially could break the renewable and storage and say renewable, and this is the energy in a bottle or in a gas pipeline, and let's bring it to where it's needed.
Yeah, so just to pick up from one side, so Statkraft, the wider group definitely sees hydrogen as a big part of that kind of future solution as well. So it's still very early stages. I think we've just kind of announced some involvement in Norway around a project that's looking at the whole value chain for green hydrogen, specifically for kind of heavy industrial use, and it's really about, for us at least, it's about those demand areas that are typically very hard to otherwise decarbon, so heavy transport, heavy industrial use. So yeah, I kind of agree. I think it's definitely going to be a big part of the future, and I think just to Laura's point as well, that's one of many parts that have to all come together here. The scale of the challenge is such that it can't entirely be placed at the door of just battery technologies or other storage technologies or just hydrogen. Omitting any one of those just requires such a massive and rapid deployment of all of the others that I think it's inevitably, perhaps it's Nova's point, inevitably has to be everything playing a part. And I think often the demand side of that is quite often forgotten as well. So, yes, to purely flatten a solar curve requires some significant storage that makes that easily ineffective. But actually the demand side can flex to meet the supply side as well, and so a lot of the extent to which small or large or short or long duration storage will play a part, I think in my mind is intertwined with the extent to which things like vehicle to grid and mass domestic demand side response and flexibility kind of takes off as well. And I hope that they all kind of run in tandem fast enough that we achieve the objectives there.
I mean,
yeah,
going back to the fridge in the kitchen, right? I mean, in many ways, what we haven't done is looked at all at mechanisms by which we can unlock that capital asset, that distributed capital asset. And if I'm putting solar on my roof, it's £8,000, which is as much for me as it is for Ørsted to put a big offshore wind farm. I mean, proportionally to my capabilities. And in many ways, what we need to do is to create in markets absolute equality between supply measures and demand measures. And if you create equality, storage sits sort of in between on all of those different parts of the market. But currently, we've got lots of support going into supply and very, very little, if anything, really on the demand side. And if we don't get the demand right, actually, we're going to end up having milk lakes and butter mountains of renewable assets because we're not utilizing them effectively because we haven't optimized the demand.
I think it's a really good point. I just want to jump in here because I've got a bit of a question from the audience, which I think is going to, it goes in the right direction. I mean, first of all, it seems like you've got a little bit of agreement. You've got a fan here, Nick. Todd seems to be agreeing with the point you made, but maybe also coming to what Laura just said, it links into what Todd asked, is basically, well, how do we actually get that change in the market and market framework to allow that? Because we're all talking here about what needs to happen and what needs to change, but the question that Todd poses, I think, is really relevant. Like, how do we actually achieve this? Just through these conversations, or what can we as an industry actually do to push the market into the right direction and work with regulators and policymakers to enable that?
Can I maybe try that first? So, I think one of the things that made me think from what Chris was talking about, the idea that we're working with such large power systems, and how can you, from one perspective, to not answer the question directly, but how do you look at some of these different ways to demonstrate different markets without having to actually install huge megawatts or gigawatts worth of equipment in the field and actually test it out and see if it works? I mean, that's just not realistic. But I think there are some tools that we, at least within the Department of Energy, that we've been trying to develop. We've just developed this at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado, a facility called ARES, which is looking at demonstrating at scale, can you go up to like 20 megawatts and actually use some of our high performance computing capability to virtually emulate the larger power system. So look at large scale, real infrastructure combined with a virtual power system and really understand what are some of the implications of some of these different market structures or different ideas that you want to implement without actually having to do it, run it on the actual power system and find out in real time that this isn't exactly the method that you wanted to do the first time. So I think there's some broad tools that at least from the our national labs we're trying to develop to help sort of de-risk some of these big ideas. Because the power system is so important. You can't, you have to really understand what you're doing to make sure that the power system works for the people that you're supporting and the industries that you're supporting. So these kind of tools, I think, are really critical. I think one other thing I would just say is, one thing that helps us and that we're trying to think about it is to sort of to say what Laura is saying, and that maybe in a slightly different way, is to say, don't focus on the technologies, which I agree with, but focuses on the services that they provide. If you can pull those, dissociate those things and say, here are the services that these technologies provide, regardless of the technology, you move toward a market that makes sense, or that you can, that you're paying for X as opposed to electrochemical storage battery Y. You really have to think about, what does the power system really need, and let's make sure I can pay for that particular service that it provides.
Anything to add from anyone else on the panel to that? Any other thoughts?
That raises a really important point, and that is we are moving, although our markets and our market design and our regulation isn't moving, but we are moving from a commodity to a service economy. And that creates very different markets, timeframes, investment profiles. And if you look, for example, at how the balancing market in the UK works, the electricity system operator is responsible for balancing the system. Now, that all sounds fantastic. Actually, what they don't have responsibility for, what I'm pushing them to have responsibility for, is for the overall long-term system costs in how they procure that. So what they're doing is buying stuff very erratic, to balance the system, undertake their responsibilities, that's no problem. But if they were to understand the fully loaded costs over a period of time, they might actually make a different selection, because it might be more expensive just in that moment, but actually the overall cost of the system would be lowered by taking a longer term, greater investment type decision. And that's where we've got to. We are in the commodity game, and actually we need to be in the service game. And our commodity, our renewable commodity, is a perishable. And that's where storage is absolutely crucial in this balancing. But it is, market design is a major, major problem in the sector.
Absolutely. I think that's a kind of great point to leave that piece of the discussion at. And I'd like to kind of take a little bit of a step change and move on. We've got about 15 minutes left. We've got lots of questions coming in as well. So I think moving on from the discussion around market frameworks, talking about technology diversity, I think a really crucial aspect when we're looking at the sector is ultimately the investment that is coming into the sector. And I think at IHS Markit, what we're doing at the moment is working with lots of different types of clients from financial industry, from the oil and gas industry, who are looking at the storage sector really as a key enabler for the energy transition. And there's a lot of capital actually coming into the sector right now, and a lot of changes happening. And I think it's really exciting. I've been in storage for about 7 years now, and this is probably the most exciting time, which I thought wasn't possible if we look back a few years. But maybe two types of questions here. And first, I'll probably throw it to you, Chris, given that BP acquired Lightsource a few years ago. From the oil and gas perspective, we're seeing lots of O&G majors looking at the storage industry, looking at different technologies to invest in. Are you seeing a bit of a step change from both your parent company, but across the industry that's really shifting towards clean technology and in particular energy storage?
So the answer to that is yes, absolutely. So I'm fortunate to have the role within Lightsource BP to be the interface on the technology side with the BP. And by the way, BP is 50%, so we're not completely eaten yet. So the oil and gas majors clearly carbon footprint investment challenges and investor challenges in the last few periods, and we can see what's happened with the COVID situation as well. So the parts of the business within the oil and gas sector who are in the renewables area have noticed, have seen clearly that we are pretty much unencumbered by the challenges and the spot price of oil, which is all over the place. What the oil and gas majors have clearly, and the clue is in the word gas, is they have a lot of knowledge and a lot of infrastructure and a lot of capability as far as gas is concerned. Gas transport, gas pipelines, and the LNG is the classic one. So in terms of getting to scale of the oil and gas interests, and these are multi-tens of billions, leveraging that knowledge and that capability and that infrastructure as far as the gas in particular is concerned, hydrogen fits very, very well. It's energy. There are challenges regarding clearly accessing the water and the recycling part of that, and then how to shift hydrogen. We already mentioned converting that to ammonia, and many of the engine manufacturers and power generators are looking at ammonia as well as hydrogen. But that's the easiest route to get to the kind of scale that the oil and gas majors would like to get to very, very short, in a very short period of time. And also clearly have done very well in the last 5 to 6 years, moving from where they were purely into renewables, maybe not leveraging as much of their oil and gas knowledge as would be possible if we move to the kind of environment I just mentioned. So a lot of enthusiasm from the oil and gas to get into this sector, not particularly clear where. We've not seen a lot of excitement on the lithium ion. What we have clearly, however, also seen is the oil and gas majors wishing to become carbon neutral, or at least offset all of their carbon of their core business. And we are currently working on 4 projects, for example, with BP at their off-grid facilities. And almost all of the larger BP facilities are off-grid because they require so much power, and to drop solar next door to those. So even within oil and gas as a core business, there is a lot of opportunity to drop in renewables. And we're looking, as I say, in Egypt and other locations in the Middle East, and also in the Americas, at bringing some of the carbon footprint of the oil and gas majors to a lower level, There's an opportunity cost there as far as BP is concerned. Clearly, they can sell the gas rather than use it as generators. But green hydrogen in a shape or form is absolutely a focus for BP and for many of the other oil and gas majors that we've seen outside of the US.
Absolutely. And maybe kind of further to the rest of the panel, maybe a slightly different question from a different type of investment community, I think. And Nick, maybe you can comment on this. We're seeing a lot of investors now getting comfortable with storage business models, and there's definitely a lot of capital coming into the industry, driving down cost of capital, which then in turn enables new projects. What do you think is most important to get institutional investors comfortable with energy storage as an asset class, and how can we further advance that in the future?
Yeah, I think you're right. You know, there's definitely over the last kind of couple of years been a kind of better appreciation and understanding, I think, for the nature of storage returns and investment, at least from those that, you know, I think have been spending the time to really understand the drivers and the kind of investment risks and the nature of what the revenue stack needs to look like. So, you know, it's hard to say kind of what more needs to happen. You know, there are people that have got there, but it generally still is kind of stuck a little bit in the sort of standalone sphere, I would say, predominantly. So we're still seeing the majority of projects that are moving forward through those investment gates be kind of standalone. And you know, I think one of the challenges there is the fact that is still the predominant kind of optimum strategy for those kind of storage. So if you look at something like a kind of co-location of storage with solar or wind, you know, we would like to see more of that kind of thing coming forward. But the reality today is, you know, taking those two assets and even looking at them as a hybrid asset, still the optimum thing to do is probably operate that storage almost as an independent asset and optimize across some different revenue streams, frequency response and so on. So it ends up operating quite independently anyway. And so actually, if you're co-locating that with a renewable plant, in some cases you can end up constraining or restricting that business model compared to the situation where you would have deployed that on its own separate grid connection. However, I think, you know, how could that change? I think increasingly we'll start to see more investors kind of approaching storage as more of a, I guess, like a diversification or a little bit of a hedge, if you like, against the risks of subsidy-free renewables. So, you know, that's how I would like to see those kind of barriers falling away, is actually people approaching it as a complementary asset to a portfolio. So the nice thing about storage returns, obviously they tend to be kind of either uncorrelated or negatively correlated with the risk return profile of an entirely merchant renewable plant. So for example, if you have kind of periods of generally low average pricing, that's not great for a merchant solar plant right now. But actually, provided the shape and the volatility is still there, your storage part of that portfolio might still be performing okay. And similarly, kind of more volatility, negative pricing, even pretty bad in the context of standalone solar subsidy-free. But again, if you have storage in the portfolio, then the returns in that scenario are gonna actually improve. So really, it's about looking at it in that kind of portfolio approach sort of way. And maybe what challenges right now for unlocking that for investors in a bigger way is the kind of complexity in a way of looking at all the various kind of market scenarios that can play out. But, you know, particularly at the moment, more so than ever, there's a lot of uncertainty about you know, what the long-term market price curve and volatility is going to look like. So kind of modeling that and an optimum kind of mix of a flex type asset return like storage along with renewables is quite a difficult task. And so I think there's a lot of concern about building out on that basis and maybe making that decision too early, or making the wrong decision about the configuration or size of storage that complements well. But I think there's a lot of investors kind of biding their time a bit, waiting for the right moment to do this in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Go on, Laura.
I mean, there is a bit of a problem, because you rightly say that some people are starting to get a bit more comfortable with storage. The problem, in my view, is that actually the market is mispricing all of this quite fundamentally. And then the problem is that investors get nervous when the market changes, even if it's changing to accommodate their particular business model. So we're a little bit as people are getting relaxed with the market is showing how erratic and in some ways unsustainable it is, whether that be zero marginal cost, cannibalized markets, all of these aspects. But I would personally say that, again, if we go back to this service economy rather than a commodity economy, we can start to unlock a much greater set of different markets and different utilizations. But then maybe, and this might upset the audience, I don't know who they all are, but we've had a lot of investors in the energy sector who possibly could be called sort of semi-rent collectors. And actually what we need is a hybrid between sort of those people who are looking for long-term investment in assets, but also those people who are looking at revenues and venture capital too. And if we can get to a place where this exciting dynamic energy system is moving forward with lots of different assets, with lots of different potential, we will need both in the sector. Otherwise, it will become very much a sort of old-fashioned RAB type model.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point to raise as well, and that we need that kind of investor diversity and make sure people are getting comfortable with the different business models, with the different technologies. Now, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm quite keen to kind of move the discussion towards wrapping things up. And I think to celebrate the fact that we've gotten through almost an hour without talking about COVID-19, which I think at this time is pretty special. I don't think I've been on a call for an hour without talking about it over the last 3 months. Because of that, I want to think about, okay, what does the future hold? So as a kind of closing statement, we're now seeing a lot of talk around green stimulus packages across the world that could help accelerate the economy as we're coming out of this crisis, but of course could play a key role for the energy transition and driving renewable deployment, and in turn drive energy storage deployment. Maybe as a really short closing statement that I'll throw to each of you, go for each of you to answer this, is kind of what would you like to see to enable energy storage along renewables if we go the assumption that there's going to be green stimulus packages? And yeah, what would you like to see in that to enable storage, help us drive out of the crisis that we've just had and enable the long-term transition? I don't know, maybe Kevin, you want to start with you?
Sure, I'm probably going to turn away from your question a little bit, but I am excited about, I think we at Department of Energy are really excited about, with our Energy Storage Grand Challenge, about thinking about how all these different pieces, different technologies can provide those kinds of services that we talked about. And I think, we're trying to bring all the different, we've got so many, stovepipes within the department, whether over the years, whether it's been vehicles or buildings, but we're really bringing all those pieces together. And I am really excited about some of the infrastructure that we've built at some of our national labs to look at how, even at scale, we can see how all those pieces really fit together, and can sort of virtually emulate how a power system of the future could really work in a variety of different ways, and in different markets for that matter, to see what makes sense for utilities and for governments. So I'm excited about the path we're moving forward on. I'm excited about the future of energy, and with a clean, reliable, and resilient power system using energy storage in all its forms and fashions. So I think it's a good time to be in the energy world.
Absolutely. Chris, what's your view?
I come back probably to almost the start in if we can look at having a smart electron, and that would be digital inertia, that would be reactive current light, that would be voltage control rather than just an electron kilowatt hour, that actually, we believe has a lot of low-hanging fruit opportunity, which could increase the penetration on the grid in the Western world. And then as a final point, or as a point for discussion, I wonder whether if we think of sub-Saharan Africa, 650 million people without electricity, they are going to be powered, and they are starting to be powered now by renewables with storage. And their solution, efficiency and application of mini grids, sub-grids for whole counties which will never be on grid, I wonder whether they will be giving us actually a lesson in 5 to 10 years' time. 650 million people with smartphones, smart money, and no electricity. We're electrifying them on a healthcare and council and household levels, but that environment will be 100% renewable, and they will solve their energy storage requirement and/or usage to match that. And it wouldn't surprise me at all in a relatively sort of free, unregulated environment. The solutions that turn up there could well give us some pointers about where we should be heading in a relatively developed economy and environment, and very solid, secure infrastructure that's quite difficult to bend.
Absolutely, no, really interesting point. I think great perspective. Going clockwise on my screen would leave Nick next. So Nick, what's your kind of final thoughts to leave us with?
Yeah, I think my ask, if you like, from the, what more could we do, what barriers could be removed. I think for me it'd be around kind of pace of decision making and kind of urgency here, particularly from kind of and governments. So actually, I think on a positive note, a lot of the things are pretty well identified and are actually in some way in train, but there are some terrible examples of just how long things have taken. So in GB specific, but this kind of BSUOS reform for storage has been, I think by the time it gets implemented, it'll be about 4 years from when it was first identified. That we just can't do things like that going forward if we're to kind of meet the scale of the challenges. So I think for me it would be that kind of pace of change, and the second, just kind of more of the same kind of good awareness and raising that profile, if you like, on what storage and flexibility more generally can do for the system and how important that is. And actually, if I can end on a kind of COVID point, actually I think one of the positive outcomes from that is clearly that what it's done in my view is put into focus a little bit how important that flexibility is. So it's cost a lot of money in terms of balancing cost over the last few months for National Grid and GB here to kind of solve this problem of sudden major drop of demand and oversupply. So it's a little bit of a taste, I think, of kind of what a highly decarbonised system looks like. So if anything, yeah, I hope that has kind of put at front and centre of policymakers' minds and so on, the importance of flexibility and storage and solving challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And Laura, final thoughts from you?
And I totally agree. I've just put down that I thought that COVID was a window into the future in terms of these changing in peaks and changing in system design. I mean, I would love a lot more money going into a renewable energy system. But what I'd be really worried about is if it went into the system as it's designed today. Because if we do it as it's designed today, we will end up with these butter mountains. We will end up with non-optimized system design. And to be frank, the cost will then be socialized. And the more supply that we have on the system, actually, the more that smart digitalization system design actually is killed. Because we need that tension between demand and supply to really open up the technology elements and in some ways the productivity. And there is nothing more productive than the term net zero. It is all about getting more from less.
I think that's a really good point to wrap things up on. I think we're pretty much on time, and yeah, thank you so much to all 4 of you for this really engaging discussion. I have to say I've been part of a lot of panel discussions through the last 3 months where everyone sat at home, and I really thought today was very different and really good perspectives from all of you. And thank you so much for sharing those with me, with the audience. I think we've had great engagement from the audience as well, and we've been able to answer a lot of questions. I think I couldn't have wrapped it up much better than what you said, Laura, and it's all about how storage can help us achieve those targets, and we need to move quickly, and we need to move in a productive way to enable that. So with that, thank you so much to the 4 of you. To the audience, thank you so much for listening to us. If you have any other questions, I'm sure you can get in touch with the panelists through many different channels these days. So definitely keen to hear from you, and hopefully speak to you all soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.